Hello and welcome to this episode of Just a Moment. Today, we're going to be talking about the Bay Area's big bad housing. My guests with me today are South San Francisco City Council member James Coleman and UWBA Director of Housing Justice, Karen Nemsick. Karen, James, welcome. To start off, I want to know if you can give us a little background on how it is that you came to do the work of housing justice and what that term means to you. Karen? Sorry.
So I'm really interested in housing justice because we've had a lot of housing injustice in this country. We're hearing a lot more now about redlining back in the 20s, 30s, 40s, where people of color were not allowed to buy homes in certain areas. They weren't provided mortgages in certain areas.
Here are two maps. The map on the left shows COVID hotspots in Alameda County during the height of the pandemic. And the one on the right is an old redlining map that segregated communities. Believe it or not, these two maps actually tell the same story. How racism continues to play a significant part in our post-racial society. Over 80 years ago, a federal agency called the Homeowners Loan Corporation created residential security maps of major American cities. These maps documented mortgage lending risk by coding neighborhoods with one of four colors, with green being the best and red being hazardous. Hazardous or red line communities were denied access to capital investment, which could improve the housing and economic opportunity of its residents. Unfortunately, the only hazard that was in these communities was that they were predominantly Black. Redline maps were used to destroy Black communities in order to build the interstate system, and they were also used to determine the locations of schools, banks, grocery stores, and even clinics. During the pandemic, the Bay Area Equity Atlas showed that years of this type of discrimination and economic exclusion made Bay Area communities of color more susceptible to COVID-19. The sad reality is that many of our current poverty concerns stem from these racist policies.
We also saw discrimination, people who were prevented from having access to first-time home buyer programs and higher education programs after the wars, so veterans. And I think that particularly earlier in this century, owning a home was a way to generate wealth for your family. Home prices have continued to go up. But when people of color were preventing that from happening, what you have is white people owning all the properties and people of color who have been unable to gain the generational wealth in that manner. So we have a huge discrepancy in family wealth between families of color and white families.
You know, one of the things that comes up a lot whenever we start talking about housing is the idea of generational wealth. And I wonder, James, if you maybe can explain briefly like what that actually is and what that means in the context of housing.
So in many ways, middle-class homeownership has become kind of the only vehicle to building generational wealth. That is wealth that you can pass down to your family and also have security in the wealth that you're building as a family. And that has only been given to homeowners in this country. When you look at the assets owned by renters versus homeowners, for renters, it's only about 2.5% that of homeowners. And yet we've made homeownership so unattainable for so many families throughout the United States. And we're leaving behind a whole class of renters who are unable to build that generational wealth if they're unable to own that home.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but like that's a problem that's happening all over the US, right? That's all over the country. So what is it about the housing crisis that is so unique to the Bay Area?
I think the Bay Area is ground zero when it comes to the housing crisis. I mean, there are areas elsewhere in the United States where they're seeing the impacts and they're seeing their housing prices go up, to 300, 400,000. But here in San Mateo County, we are the only county that has a median home value of over $2 million. We have a pretty obscene jobs to housing ratio where we don't have nearly enough units of housing to accommodate the demand that is needed for the homes here in the Bay Area. And so you see so many people competing for the same homes who are commuting hours to get to those homes. And if they don't have those high-paying jobs, they're often priced out of the communities that they've lived in and grew up in for many years of their life.
Yeah. What do you think, Karen?
Well, I think when we talk about the housing situation in the Bay region, a lot of it is that we have started looking at housing as a financial mechanism, as a tool to gain more wealth, rather than a place where you raise your children, rather than a place of stability for your family, where your family can live affordably for a number of years. So I think we've kind of changed the economy where you can only afford a home if your income is great, if your income is very high. And that's changed the way our communities work. That's changed the way people are just not as stable. So our communities are less sustainable when you have people moving in, moving out, when you have people using a house to flip, not living in it, sending it to the next highest buyer. You're not building a community in a neighborhood. So I think that that the main issue here is that we've changed housing to being a home, from being a home to being something that's just a financial tool.
Sure.
To increase wealth.
Yeah, and just adding on to that, we're treating it as an investment vehicle, and you can see these large corporate firms purchasing all these homes and flipping it, especially when it comes to large apartment buildings, right? With the Ellis Act, you can see large corporate real estate companies come in, purchase an entire apartment, evict everyone, invoking the Ellis Act, and then renting it at higher prices, and then flipping that apartment building, as leading to millions and millions of dollars in profit for them. And it comes from the idea that we're treating, like you said, housing as an investment vehicle and not as a human right. And that, I think, is also the center of housing justice, is recognizing that everyone, regardless of your income, race, sexual orientation, everything, if you are a human being, you have a right to a safe and stable home. And that is something that we need to invoke in our communities.
Property is being used specifically for the purpose of gaining profit for some. And for everyone else, they're basically getting evicted and not having access to that property. So what's the alternative? Like, I know that, James, one of the things that you work on is the idea of social housing. Can you explain a little bit more about that and how that applies?
So simply put, social housing is mixed income housing that is owned and operated by local government, right? By whether it be your cities, your counties, or the state of California, is housing that is owned and operated by local government. And as opposed to public housing, the United States has a history of public housing that has largely failed because it has been defunded, it has been over cost, to build it has been over cost, it has been over time, and it has been segmented to only be available to a small segment of the population. So only the very lowest income. And so with public housing, it has been unsustainable in the long term. Much of it has fallen into disrepair. And a lot of people look at it as with a negative connotation, because it is not housing that is accessible to the vast majority of people. As opposed to public housing, social housing is available to the vast majority of people, including the working and middle classes. And it is income blind and cost neutral. Income blind meaning that we recognize housing as a human right. And so large swaths of the population can access mixed income social housing, and revenue neutral in that it is self-sustainable. It is mixed income, which means it pays for itself. It does not require continued public investment decades and decades down the line.
And I think James talks a lot about social housing from a renter's perspective, and how to, just what you were saying, how to have a long lease to be able to stay in your place if you're a renter.
Yeah, and I think it's important to realize that social housing models exist very successfully throughout Europe and throughout East Asia. The big examples are Vienna, where roughly 40-60% of their housing is publicly owned. In Singapore, it's 80%. In Hong Kong, it's 40%. but in the United States, it's less than a fraction of 1% that is publicly owned. Part of that is because of restrictions at the federal and state level. There's this thing called the Faircloth Amendment at the federal level that restricts the net amount of units that can be publicly owned by HUD, right? So you cannot add an additional unit of public housing to the entire United States public housing stock. You can take away 10 and add 10 back, but you cannot raise it. In California, in 1950, segregationists were successfully able to pass a constitutional amendment called Article 34 that does not allow cities to, or any public agency to build their own affordable housing unless it's first voted on by the public, which is a big hurdle that a lot of communities struggle with. But in South San Francisco, we were able to get that authorization last year through Measure AA that authorized our city to embark on building or acquiring social housing. It passed by roughly 20%, and that's going to allow us to do so.
I think I'll just step in one more second.
Sure, yeah.
James, you had some statistics last time we spoke about housing costs, and when you have social housing, the cost of housing can be much lower. So in the United States, we have a parameter that says you should be paying 30% of your income on rent, but not more than that, or on housing, right? 30%. Right now in the Bay Area, we have people paying up to 50% of their monthly income for their rent, for their housing. But James, what are the rates in Vienna and Hong Kong?
Yeah. So in Vienna, residents typically pay between 4 to 8% of their income on rent. When it comes to Hong Kong, it's around 4 to 6%. And like you said, here in the Bay Area, or in all the United States, we kind of landed on this pretty ambiguous number, this arbitrary number of 30% you're rent burdened. And it's unconscionable to be paying your rent that is in the single digits of your pre-tax income.
Yeah.
But what we really need in the United States is to have more imagination, right? To look at other countries and realize that those models exist and those models work, and learn how we can take those models and apply it here in the United States. Because imagine what it would mean to a family if they weren't paying $4,000 to $6,000 a month on rent, and instead they were paying something like $1,000. I mean, the median income for a family in San Mateo County is around $157,000. I know, very large, but 8% of that would be $1,050 per month on rent. So imagine what that would mean for a family and how much that money can be paid towards education, healthcare, recreation, just other areas that would benefit an everyday working class family.
Yeah, it's amazing.
I mean, that sounds like the impact would be almost immediate and exponential. But Karen, what is UWBA doing and how do we partner with, officials like James here to help support and implement some of these policy initiatives?
Sure. So we do a lot of work with policymakers in the Bay Area. When we're talking with someone like James, who is very knowledgeable about housing, he's teaching me more than we're working with him. But we have a small but mighty policy team at UWBA, and they work on reaching out to policymakers in all of the 8 counties that we work in to talk about policies that are good for communities, policies that encourage affordable housing, policies that are looking at social housing. So we are working throughout the Bay Area, throughout the region, really to educate and to enlighten policymakers about what their peers are doing. Hey, I might talk to someone in another county and say, this is what James in South San Francisco are doing about social housing. I want to introduce you so that you can take this on too. Or it could be using the United Way Bay Area's visibility and reputation to bring light to some of these legislative issues, to bring light to more pro-housing issues. We work in 8 counties because the entire Bay Area is being impacted by housing right now. What happens in San Francisco when a lot of wealth comes into San Francisco is first people moved to Oakland, then they moved to Richmond, now they're moving to Vallejo. It impacts every single county, and that's why we're working with policymakers in all of those counties.
And I really have to stress how important it is to have nonprofits like United Way Bay Area assist us as policymakers, because in South San Francisco, we can build 10,000 units of housing, but it's going to be a drop in the bucket when it comes to the entire Bay Area. What we really need is every city, every county in the Bay Area building their fair share of affordable housing and passing the policies that are necessary to do so. And it requires nonprofits with a regional focus like United Way to tell us as policymakers what works and what doesn't work and how we can be doing our job the best.
And speaking of regional policy, you know that we have we're working with a lot of housing organizations in the Bay Area to put a measure on the 2024 ballot to create a region-wide general obligation fund to provide more funds to develop more housing throughout the region. This is going to be overseen by the Bay Area Housing Finance Authority, and it has the potential for billions of dollars to be now directed towards creating affordable housing at all income levels throughout the city. So that's something that we'll be working with James and a lot of our nonprofit housing partners, is this 2024 general obligation bond. That is a regional bond. It's something different. It's not county by county or city by city, and it's not statewide. It's a Bay Area region specific bond.
You know, we started this conversation off talking a lot about individuals and families and, you know, the need and importance for generational wealth. And I kind of want to bring it back to that. And James, I know you talk a lot, when you talk about social housing, you talk a lot about community resilience. And so I guess I want to just ask, like, what is the impact of everything that we're talking about, all of the policies, all of the initiatives that we're trying to support, the ideas about social housing? What does that actually do for individuals and families?
I think at the root of it, the reason why many people strive to own a home is because we've built a system in which homeownership is the most stable form of housing. People want stability. They want to be able to plant their roots in a community and live there for the rest of their lives and raise their children and allow their children to live in that community for the rest of their lives. And in the Bay Area, we've seen time and time again gentrification. We've seen people price out their homes that they've lived in for so many years. We see students being evicted in the middle of the school year and having to completely uplift their lives. There are people living on the streets in their cars. And we've made homeownership kind of the only viable long-term housing form. But we should also extend that to renters. I mean, in Vienna, 80% of residents choose to rent. And that's because they have created a system that gives that same stability that homeowners have in the United States to renters. And we can have policies that bring stability to renters throughout the United States. In Vienna, over 80% of residents qualify for public housing. And once you have that public housing, you can live there for the rest of your life. And you can also pass it down to your children. And this is rental housing that we're talking about. That concept's unheard of here in the United States. And here we, again, back to being rent burden. If you live in affordable housing, chances are you're paying around 30% of your income on rent. And then once you make a little above that threshold, you have to move out. And we know that there is the missing middle. We don't have enough middle income housing. And so our entire middle class is struggling with finding stable housing and are forced being moved around and around. But what we really need is to build social housing. And if someone gets that home, we let them know that is your home and you can stay there for the rest of your life. That's the number one thing that we need to do is create that sustainable, stable rental housing.
And that's important for sustaining communities.
Yeah.
You know, communities are healthier when everybody has a place to live. Communities are healthier when you know everybody on your block, whether you're there for 3 years or 33 years. But when you know people on your block, it's a safer neighborhood. People keep an eye on each other. People help each other, support each other. And when you have neighborhoods where it's not only million homes, but it's a neighborhood where you've got a couple rental houses, you've got a couple 4-unit, 6-unit rental buildings. You have a neighborhood that's close to public transit that everybody has a space for. You have a neighborhood where you can walk to your grocery store, where you can get decent food. That's what builds a thriving community.
Well, you've certainly given us a lot to think about, and I appreciate both of you taking a moment of your time. Karen, James, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
If you want to find out more about our Housing Justice Initiative and the policies that we're supporting, visit us on the web at uwba.org or on socials at UWBA and join in the conversation. Use the hashtag #TheWorkUWBA. We'll see you next time.